Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Klimberg from HCSS. Welcome to the afternoon strategy session. The topic is preparing the battle space, and you will note that this is not phrased as a question, but a statement, because governments are clearly maneuvering themselves to position themselves not only to facilitate cyber espionage, but also engage in cyber conflict across the spectrum of activities, extending to the use of force and even the equivalent of armed attack, commonly considered to be the benchmark of a casus belli. And we've seen it all in action. To this day, the run-up to the cyber attacks in Georgia in 2008 are taught as a textbook of example of what preparing the battle space looks like. But we are looking at a battle space that is larger than the Caucasus and 10 years later. And according to Wired, 10 years is 40 years in internet time, and a lot has happened in between. Now, many of you may agree that preparing the battle space may be occurring, but it is quite likely that you have different definitions of what exactly this means. As Paul Nicholas quoted from a Senate hearing earlier yesterday, he pointed out that despite our very best efforts, many of the definitions are still unclear. So we are lucky to be able to draw on some of the US military terms to help provide some clarity on what this can mean. For instance, many of you will be familiar with the term CNA for cyber network attack, CNE for cyber network exploitation, and CND for computer network defense, computer network attack, computer network exploitation, computer network defense, which were first defined over 17 years ago and which formed the definition of cyber activities. Today, the key document, JP 312, has subdivided some of those tasks, splitting up, for instance, C&D into tasks such as defensive cyber operations, but more relevant to our discussion today, has also split up the CNE, what used to be known as computer network exploitation or espionage. Today, the main tasks are ISR for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and OPE. OPE is a direct translation of what is known as preparing the battlefield and means operational preparation of the environment. Now, OPE is not very well defined, so even the transparency of the US Department of Defense has limits, and so the unclassified definition is a little vague. It means gaining and maintaining access to a system or position capabilities for follow-on action. So we can guess what this means, not only for the US, but for any advanced cyber attacker. In the very least, it includes the ability to have persistent access to an adversarial system using hooks and beacons, or even persistent presence, such as actively being on the network with your own software. Most extreme, it can include the pre-positioning of so-called cyber weapons, for instance, dark energy, on energy grids pretty much everywhere. What the term OPE does not include, at least in the US definition, is, however, other tasks that sometimes are included under preparing the battle space, but would be considered covert action. Supply chain sabotage, for instance, which can range from compromising the MD5 hash to an update of a commercial operating system, or to level 1 backdoors that have been fully integrated into FPGA chip, or, for instance, visions of potential stockpiles of 0 days that are hoarded away and then suddenly are released to the public with catastrophic consequences. Or, for instance, the possible undermining of the very core of the internet standards by, for instance, sabotaging or undermining encryption, or by, for instance, less subtle attempts to influence standard-setting processes in the Internet Engineering Task Force, the W3C, and many other organizations that effectively build internet. And these are just technical perspectives. Some countries take a totally different view of preparing the battle space, which goes beyond cybersecurity and includes information warfare aspects as well. To discuss these issues today and more, we have a great panel. Mr. William Saito is a special advisor to the Cabinet of the Government of Japan. Having started software programming in elementary school, he's a prolific entrepreneur and venture capitalist dedicated to information technology issues. He was named by Nikkei as one of the 100 most influential people of Japan. He's a foundation board member of the World Economic Forum, and in early 2012, Mr. Saito was appointed to the Council on National Strategy and Policy that reports directly to the Prime Minister of Japan. He has been recognized as a leading authority on encryption, biometric authentication, and cybersecurity. Professor Isaac Ben Israel is the head of the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center of Tel Aviv University, among many other positions, and is a former Major General of the Israeli Defense Forces. He joined the Israeli Air Force in 1967 and served continuously up to his retirement in 2002. He has fulfilled a multitude of research analysis tasks in IAF, the military, as well as Israeli MOD, and was twice awarded the Israeli Defense Award. He has also served as a member of the Knesset, where he was a member of numerous security-related committees. Olof Coleman is the Chief Internet Technology Officer of ISOC, the Internet Society, one of the defining civil society organizations that helped form most of the Internet. Olof describes himself as an Internet generalist and an evangineer, which I imagine is an evangelist and engineer together, somebody with deep knowledge on some of the Internet's technical aspects, who particularly enjoys bridging the technology society policy gaps. Olof has been involved in Internet technology since his astronomy studies during the early 90s. He is the IETF ISOC representative of the European Multi-Stakeholder Platform on ICT Standardization and, this is a trick question, a trusted community representative in the context of DNS root signing ceremony. If you don't know what that is, it means he's not actually a key holder of the Internet, but he gets to watch the key holders of the Internet do their job. And there's not many of them. Ms. Elina Nor is Director of Foreign Policy and Security Studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia. Elina read law at Oxford University and obtained an LLM in Public International Law from the London School of Economics and Political Science, graduating with distinction at the top of her class. A recipient of the Malaysian Prime Minister's Fellowship Award, she holds an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown University, where she was a Women International Security Scholar. She was previously a key team member of the Brookings Institution's project on U.S. relations with the Islamic world in its formative years post-September 11th, 2001. And Dr. James Andrew Lewis is Senior Vice President and Program Director for the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. Before joining CSIS, he worked in different positions in the US government. Most of you will be familiar with him because he has played a key role in both cyber research, Track 1.5 diplomacy, and most importantly, the development of cyber norms in recent years. In the latter function, he was a rapporteur for the 2010, 2013, and 2015 UN Group of Government Experts on Information Security. Jim was there at the beginning of discussion of cyber norms, and he'll probably be there at the end as well. So, that's the question, isn't it? Yeah. So all these speakers, like myself, are associated with the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. I'd like to point out, however, that we are not speaking in that capacity today. This question that we are dealing with today is actually not one of the questions that the Commission will be looking at, although we'll be looking at specific sub-questions related to it. I'd like to turn to my first speaker. So the first question I have is that William, we heard yesterday, for instance, that 30 governments are preparing for offensive cyber operations. Now, you not only have seen the political advisory side, but you also have very significant private sector experience, such as on the boards of Palo Alto Networks and similar. What do you think when you hear of nations preparing the battle space, or the terms operational preparation of the environment? So, and what the extent of these preparations for conflict only limited to governments? Do governments sometimes use other actors, and what do you think their response should be?
Thank you very much for that introduction, Alex. I'm very honored to speak here, and let me frame the discussion. I find it incredible that if you look at time frames, as Alex pointed out, 10 years is 40 years in internet time. The internet has only been around for close to 50 years. That the first packet was sent in October of 1969, and then just 30 years later, with the advent of things like SSL and the opening up of RSA, we have something called security that allows businesses to use this for business processes and the world that we know it in terms of e-commerce and such. Just 20 years after that, we're throwing around words like Battlespace, and so I must say that that's quite frightening. In that time horizon, I think 10 years from now, I would be very interesting to see what this conference will hold. And 10 years is a long time. If you think about it, 10 years ago in this field, if you look at the top 5 largest companies by valuation, 10 years ago, they were all oil related. In just 10 short years, all 5 of those top companies in the world by valuation are now IT related. So it's obviously a data the new oil type paradigm that we see here. One of the things that I see here as both on the public policy side and government, but also having my foot in private businesses, is how the government-business relationship is here. And up to now, it used to be a simple world. I used to call it the ABC of securities, where security from a governmental perspective was actually pretty manageable. A for ABC, A was atomic, B was biological, C was chemical. But the next letter, D, or digital, is actually quite a big headache here for governments, because up to now, these problems, we actually took care of them in silos, and we were able to do these in some kind of way where there was a defined department or a ministry or an agency that took care of these things. The D letter actually is a very off-balancing situation for many, many governments, including my own, because it's very horizontal, it's very overarching, and it requires coordination amongst not only the various government agencies, but that the governments are now realizing that, unlike other issues, the ABCs of the past, this issue requires private company cooperation just because the infrastructure runs on it. And this is actually very unique compared to other threats in the past. Obviously, it's not constrained by physics. It's not constrained by borders, nor does it sometimes respect sovereignty. And so this is a big headache for governments also to get their understanding. It moves at the speed of light from anywhere simultaneously. And what I like to use in this case, which is I think apropos for this crowd, is that digital has definitely transformed the world from a Cold War standing to a Code War standing. And so with these non-state actors, the attribution becoming very difficult, and the asymmetry for this, I thought it'd be very useful to use phrases from old generals here, given the audience here. But the position of the interior phrases this very well with cybersecurity. You know, it was originally brought up by General Clausewitz, where as us defenders, we need to defend every single little thing, whereas the opponent only has to find one weakness. And so this is different from past threats and so on. And then the other thing about this, it really exemplifies asymmetry in that even if we want to get back at the opponent, and this is a discussion further along in today's discussion, is that the asymmetric nature of this means that the opponent may not have an ICT infrastructure worth getting back at. And so these are some of the interesting things that have to look at this. The other issue that I see from a governmental perspective often is that we often hear of the CIA of security, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But I argue that there are other areas, that there are 5 other areas that we have to look at in terms of security. Things like authentication, authorization, accountability, non-repudiation, and how we balance all this with privacy. And so these are the things that when we talk about Battlespace, we need to be cognizant about, because we also have to share this with the private sector, which, oh, by the way, it happens to run on. The frightening thing, obviously, is in the last few years, this has become and transformed itself from a logical argument to a kinetic argument. And so, yeah, how do we change the posture from a reactive engagement to something different? They often say, and I'll use a sports analogy here, that the best defense is a good offense. But does that really apply to cybersecurity? I'm not sure. I think that we are here to discuss this and debate this and figure out the various ways. I know that defining norms and defining words themselves are difficult in a multi-stakeholder session like this, but words like architecture, security by design, passive defense, active defense, intelligence, what offense really means. These are the things that I think are going to be very interesting in how to define. The other issue here is from a commercial sector and terms like hacking back and so on. I think that these are issues that before we run towards that direction, I think the private industry is still having a hard time in terms of information sharing and walking, that even if we have this type of vulnerability discussion, we still have the WannaCries of the world and find out how vulnerable we really are. Even if we get past, and businesses are able to get past the proxies and the Trojans and so on, and find out who the opponent and the bad actors are, it tends to be a whack-a-mole. It tends to be non-core to their business. And even if you do this, I think what happens is the asymmetric nature makes it difficult. However, it also becomes a situation I think we're going to see in the near future where large-scale attacks will overwhelm law enforcement in military organizations in countries, and that it will require some level of support and help and responsibility from the private sector. And how that cooperation information exchange takes place will be important. I often now quote, again, another dead general, General Moltke, that no battle plan survives the first contact with the enemy. And I think this really defines what cybersecurity is today. And so I close my opening here back to the sports analogy, that if you look at sports teams, the best sports teams that have the strongest offense, or the best sports teams that have the strongest defense, are not necessarily the strongest overall team in that sports. The people who are the best in that sports usually is the balance of offense and defense, and it's trying to find out how we get that balance between offense and defense, I think.
Thank you. So Itzhak, we just heard beforehand how the private sector plays, of course, a crucial role in also government efforts to prepare the cyber battlefield. So not least, the private sector, of course, builds and maintains most of the internet and what we would call cyberspace. So what emphasis would you put on maintaining the integrity of the supply chain, both the hardware and the software? And are there aspects of this that particularly concerns you more than others? Israel has, of course, developed a very significant technical and software industry related to cybersecurity, and is sometimes considered even being a top-tier or near top-tier cyber nation. So what lessons have you learned from being in such a position, and what can you tell us about the importance of the supply chain within the Israeli system?
Well, by supply chain, we usually mean not only hardware and software, but also people. And these are perhaps the most vulnerable link in the chain, which we tend to forget. But some, the DDoS attack on Tallinn in 2007 and the war between Russia and Georgia that was mentioned here were the first signs, and still they didn't hit the public opinion until the attack on the Iranian centrifuges in 2010, which was an attack against the supply chain. How do I know this? I mean, no one really knows who did it, but there was no network there at all. I mean, of course, neither internet or any social network, nor any secured defense network. No network at all. Still, the virus the malware found its way into these centrifuges, and you don't have to spend more than half a minute trying to guess where did it come from. It came from some other items that was not produced, like the centrifuges were produced in Iran, but some component that was not produced. People usually suspect the controllers of made in Germany by Siemens. But then again, how did it enter into these controllers? Perhaps the technicians that checked the systems, perhaps updating the software of this controller, perhaps already in the manufacturing facility, no one knows. And there is no end to it. I would like to give one example of a work that was done this year by two of my colleagues researching cyber in Israel. They instructed a PhD student who was given a task. There is a building, a top secret building. You know that there is computers somewhere in the building. You don't know where, perhaps at the basement, perhaps somewhere else. You are not allowed to enter into the building. And you have a mission to send some Trojan horse that will be implanted in this computer, and then retrieving the information from this computer. And he did it in this way. He bought, and you are not allowed to get closer than 2 kilometers from the building. He bought a commercial laser gun in IR, which you don't even see with your bare eyes. And he shot pulses of IR light on the windows, randomly, on the windows of the building. He didn't know where the computer is. And assuming that in this building, people work with the computer, they have also printers, they have scanners, they have copying machines, they have peripheral equipment. And if there are scanners there from a certain generation on, then if you shoot those pulses on the windows, they will be reflected in the room. They will hit the glass of the scanner. It will enter inside the scanner. There are sensors down there that usually this is the way a scanner works. And then the scanner will think it's an image, will send it to the computer, and here you are inside the computer. The more problematic mission was to do the other way backwards to get the information. By this malware, he ordered the scanners to work at 2 o'clock in the morning, but the light emitted from the scanners and hit the windows and penetrated the outside the world didn't have enough power. It's a question of power. So he bought a quadrocopter, small one, put the receiver on this one. He had to get closer to the windows. And at the end, he had all the information of this computer. And this is also part of the supply chain. I mean, all this equipment. There is no end to this. And therefore, I think what we do in Israel, we change the attitude. I mean, we don't try to prevent anything like this, because this is a story that tells you that whatever you do, some clever guy will find a way to bypass it. And instead of this, we try to, instead of eliminating those threats, we try to keep them in a low enough rate without a definition. We don't say 1%, 2%, because we don't know even how to measure it. Low enough rate means a rate which will enable us to continue living the way we want to live, something like this. Like the same way we all here in the audience, we all treat crimes. No one demands a zero-rate crime, but a bearable rate of crime.
Thank you, Isaac. So that was also an interesting example of how a side-channel attack will always render most supply chain systems vulnerable. Maybe the ultimate example of a side-channel attack, of course, is when you target standards directly. So for Olof, what do you think about two not quite related risks? One is the prospect of undermining standards, information security standards, undermining encryption, for instance, or trying to steer the work of critical standard-setting organizations, such as the IETF, but also others. And on the same side, what is your opinion on so-called zero-day hoarding that some actors consider to be escalatory to the overall threat of cybercrime and does not necessarily produce the higher level of security that we would need across the board? So which of these two questions do you think, or both of those questions, do you think are more relevant?
I feel they're both relevant. Let's dive into them. So I come from the Internet Society, and I take a perspective on the Internet as a global and open platform that is there for humanity to benefit from, socially, economically, and all those type of things. And I love the word confidence and a relative level of confidence and trust in that infrastructure, so that people can continue to use that. And that means that we have to counter security issues to a level where trust is can be reasonably assumed by the people who act on it. And trust, as we say in the Netherlands, comes by foot and leaves by horse. Trust is easily violated. And I feel that if you look at standardization processes, that is an area where trust is incredibly important. Because the standardization processes provide the building blocks of where we build our stuffs from. So if we're not sure that we can trust the standardization process to not have inserted the back door, I think we're in a world of pain. And there is an example of this. The Bull Run disclosures, the Bull Run project, has fairly convincingly showed that one cryptographic standards created in the ANSI context, the elliptic curve random number generator, was being tampered with. These elliptic curves work on defining curves and points on a curve and mathematical constants. And if you choose the constants in a non-random fashion, you can determine underlying cryptographic secrets and use your knowledge of those secrets to extract information. And Bullrun actually disclosed that this was the case, that this has happened, that certain parameters were standardized that are highly suspect of being having a cryptographic backdoor. And I think that is highly problematic. I think that is something where you could, if this is preparation for the battlefield, I don't know what term this is, but it's actually preparation to extract information from internet flows in a non-targeted fashion. And I think that is highly problematic. That undermines trust in standards organizations. In fact, in the IETF, there's an organization that is dear to my heart, which I can speak about but not for. We had this discussion. Trust was violated after the Snowden revelations, and one of the chairs of a research group that had to do with looking at cryptographic standards was working for the NSA, and we had a long and serious discussion about does that violate the standards process? Does that violate the trust in the outcome of the standards produced in the IETF? The conclusion in the IETF was, and I cannot speak for W3C or IEEE because I don't, you mentioned them, but I don't know the cases. But the conclusion was that the standards process in the IETF is open and transparent enough and can attract sufficient actors from different nation states, from academia, and the process is open enough so that people can actually do a decent peer review of what comes out of these processes. But that trust, the point was the trust question was raised, and I think that is something where we don't want to go. The other example you asked for, 0 days. Again, when thinking about this, I think of what makes the greatest impact on confidence in the network, and it's the untargeted results that I think break most of the confidence. Obviously, targeted results hit the news and break the confidence of people because their data is hijacked, or if Sony cannot protect themselves, how can I protect myself? That already impacts the network. But the fact that 0 days that have been collected, leak, and fairly quickly proliferate as malware and impact hospitals because their systems get ransomwared is something that needs a very good look. The issue, of course, with information, with digital information, code, and knowledge is that it proliferates. Once it's out there, it proliferates. If you have a weapons cache and it's compromised, those weapons, you cannot copy them. You cannot. They're there and they can be used, but that impact is very small. If a 0-day cache gets compromised, like the case was with the source for WannaCry, that immediately has an impact across the globe. And that, I think WannaCry was an example that made me think about perhaps we should have a discussion around confidence-building measures and stocking of 0 days, and have a new look around that after WannaCry happened.
Thank you. Elina, so we have concentrated on purely technical measures for preparing for cyber conflict so far, But other nations outside of the so-called like-minded group of nations tend to emphasize more psychological aspects of cybersecurity instead, taking it into what people here would sometimes consider information warfare territory. Does this type of thinking extend also to seeing nations preparing for full-scale conflict in social media? So is there a thought that Facebook and Twitter can be considered part of preparing the battle space?
The short answer is yes, but obviously it's a little more complicated than that. And I think it's very important to understand the context that shapes the consciousness of how nations in Asia, my part of the world, especially in Southeast Asia, approach this question of nations preparing the battle space. And I think by taking a step back, it's important to note that information or content or data, however you'd like to term it, has always been the preoccupation of governments, particularly in Southeast Asia, because that's the area I know best, since before the advent of the internet, really. And that's a function and a legacy of two things, primarily domestic political stability, socio-political stability, particularly for nations that have multi-ethnic, multi-faith societies, where the fabric of the nation becomes a national security agenda item. And secondly, because of, well, for reasons of preservation of the political regime, for the preservation of legitimacy, as well as the survival of the political regime. And what the internet did was to underline the importance of content primarily from three aspects: data collection, data manipulation, as well as data dissemination. And of the three, it is information collection, data collection, or gathering that figures in the minds of nation states the most when it comes to nation-state actors rather than nation-state actors. And I'll try to explain this a little more articulately as I go along. With data collection, I think what we've seen in recent times, particularly in the last few years, has been this growing awareness again in Southeast Asia primarily, that there is intelligence collection by nation states, and sometimes they overlap with ongoing tensions. So for example, in Southeast Asia, we have the South China Sea dispute. And in the run-up to the 2016 arbitral tribunal decision in The Hague, what you saw was a growing threat and risk of other nation-state actors guiding non-state actors, maybe, to collect intelligence on the South China Sea dispute. So you saw this overlay of what was happening in the maritime sphere with the cyber domain. And this is something new to Southeast Asian states. And even though there was awareness, primarily from open source reports about this, the reaction to these reports by South China Sea disputants in particular was very muted. Why? Because if you're a smaller state in Southeast Asia surrounded by larger neighbors, and you have fewer resources, fewer capabilities, and less of an appetite to go to war with some of your larger neighbors, then you have no choice but to be pragmatic. And the priority among many of these nation states in the developing world is to advance economic growth, not so much for the strategic security implications of the cyber domain per se. With data manipulation, the risk primarily has been from non-state actors. Political leaders in Southeast Asia have long been struggling with trolls, cyber troopers, questioning their legitimacy and their governance methods. So this is not something new to governments, but it hasn't come from nation states. It's come from within domestic political opposition factions, but also sometimes externally from other interested stakeholders. On the question of data dissemination, again, it hasn't been so much a nation-state issue for the developing world. It's been more of a non-state actor issue again. And we've seen this most clearly in recent times in the counterterrorism sphere. So things like fake news, alternative facts, long before they became terms of art, governments in Southeast Asia and other parts of the developing world were already coping with them. And in the counterterrorism sphere, what we've seen is a real concern among governments in the developing world that what is spread online is really very readily received, particularly by a younger generation that is easily radicalized. My favorite figure to quote is one given by the Malaysian Minister of Home Affairs, who also happens to be the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia. And in May 2015, reporting to Parliament, he said that of the 107 detainees at the time who had been arrested for militant activities, 75% of them had been radicalized online. So the threat really is not from nation states in the minds of governments in the developing world, it's more from nation state actors. So in the beginning, Alex, you cautioned against pushing back against your questions, but I think it's important to set the context with what is going on in the consciousness of governments in this region.
Thank you, Elina. So Jim, we've heard many different definitions of what could constitute preparing the battle space. So we have operational approaches that can fall under TTPs, if you want to use a military term. We have supply chain issues. We have standard setting issues. 0 days is an all-time favorite. And even for some countries, raising questions of the use of social media. Now, governments have also realized slowly, but that they've started to realize that despite the benefits that many governments get from a essentially lawless domain, to quote a former senior US official, it might be useful to have some rules of the road. So you've been part of the so-called cyber norms process that is encapsulated in the UN group of government experts, but also takes place within the organizations of security of the OSCE and the ARF. And there has been a number of norms have been agreed, for instance, on abstaining from attacks on critical infrastructure or the targeting of computer emergency response teams. So do these norms yet extend to tackling activities that would be covered with preparing the battle space? Is that ever going to happen?
Let me start with a clarification for people, because I actually wrote that norm, so I know what I intended when I wrote it. And I should say I wrote it at the direction of the Brazilian chair, who was a brilliant diplomat. The original proposal was that states would agree not to attack critical infrastructure in peacetime. And there were a couple countries that for some reason not the US, strangely enough, objected to the words in peacetime. And so, of course, if you're a diplomat, if you're a negotiator, one of your jobs is to figure out linguistic fixes that perhaps are imprecise in a way that's unappealing to lawyers, but that get you agreement. And so the formula that I came up with was that states agreed not to attack critical infrastructure in ways inconsistent with their obligations under international law. And that's, of course, a reference to the laws of armed conflict. So in fact, you can attack critical infrastructure. It's not a ban, and that's worth thinking about. We began with a reference to Clausewitz. It's useful to remember. I can't remember if it's page 10 or page 34 of On War, but I was reading it on the flight in, and Clausewitz warned us against thinking in the abstract, because if you think in the abstract, it leads you to extremes, right? And so you want to try and link yourself as much as possible to the realities of the situation. And in reality, if countries are going to use cyber tools to achieve effect on the battlefield or in political effect, they need to do reconnaissance, right? An easy but not entirely apt model is electronic warfare. If you don't collect the signals of your opponent, you will not know how to block them should conflict begin. If you wait until conflict starts to do this preparation of the battlefield, you will be behind, right? You will be playing catch up. So you have to do reconnaissance. It's a dynamic situation. The reconnaissance you do on June 1st may no longer be appropriate because the network has changed on August 1st. So it's a dynamic environment where reconnaissance is essential. And there is no agreement not to do this kind of thing, right? You need to do reconnaissance. The EW metaphor is inappropriate in some ways, electronic warfare metaphor, because the collection of signals for electronic warfare does not violate sovereignty. It's a passive action. And the reconnaissance you need to do to be an effective use of cyber techniques in warfare to deliver cyber effects onto a target do require a violation of sovereignty. And the international community is unsure how to deal with that. Previously, we had this kind of thing we could hide behind that, well, the internet is borderless and there are no borders, and so therefore you can't say I'm violating your sovereignty because there's no borders, I haven't crossed a border. No one agrees with that anymore. at least among states. There was agreement in 2013 that international law applies, national sovereignty applies, and the UN Charter applies to cyberspace. And the UN Charter in particular referred to Articles 2.4, that states should not feel free to use force without asking the permission of the Security Council, and Article 51, which says that states can use force for their inherent right of self-defense. There's a contradiction in there that was intentional, but we have not agreed to ban cyber conflict. We will certainly not agree to ban espionage. And so the questions for us come up to the following. What is it we can agree to constrain when it comes to this sort of reconnaissance, this sort of preparation of the battlefield? And what I fear very often is we have a sort of echo chamber discussion where the Western nations, or sometimes they're called the like-minded nations. I can tell you in private, in the UN, we call them the weak-minded nations. We have a discussion of rules that will constrain them, but will not constrain their most likely opponents, and that would be a bad outcome. So if we agree on constraints, how would we verify them? And if you think about the verification problem, and I apologize for using an arms control term, it becomes very difficult to make these sorts of agreements work until you get some sort of common understandings on the use of force. And I don't see that happening for a long time. So what I'd say is when we think about preparation of the battlefield, it's a good topic, but we need to marry it to state practice. States are going to do certain things whether we like it or not, right? And so therefore, how do we craft agreements that take into account the natural behavior of states, right, in a way that we can affect it and perhaps make the environment a little more stable? So I'm all for preparation of the battlefield. Ideally, we will never have to use it, but I think giving it up, particularly a one-sided concession, would not be in the interests of the United States or the West.
So let me just pick you up on that, for instance, and you used the example of electronic warfare, and said itself it wasn't a perfect example, but let's just step back a little bit and from a practical point of view, assume that we're all defenders in a critical infrastructure system, and we find a bit blob on our system, a 5 megabyte file that is heavily encrypted, and we have no idea what it is. It could be screenshots of emails being waited for exfiltration as part of a cyber espionage ring, but I have no economic data worth stealing because I'm a power grid, so what is it doing here? Or it could be a logic bomb or a cyber weapon that I have no access to. So don't I, as a defender on a supercritical system, have to presume that this is a weapon pointed at me and that this weapon is loaded? And how do we avoid a situation of inadvertent escalation where one actor then takes drastic responses to a threat that actually isn't there because they misattribute the intent? There's simply espionage, no reason to get upset.
So after the, 2015 negotiations where we agreed on this, no attacks on critical infrastructure contrary to your international obligations, which everyone in the room knew was code for peacetime. Shortly thereafter, there was a Russian attack against a Ukrainian critical infrastructure facility. And one of the negotiators wrote to me and said, well, so much for our norm. I wrote to the negotiator and said, so much for our norm. And he wrote back and said, maybe the Russians don't think it's peacetime, right? And I think that's the point we want to think about, is the lines between conflict and peacetime are different from what they were. This is not the Fulda Gap. You know, I flew over that last night, so I looked down with fond memories. It's a different kind of conflict. And so one of the questions would be, what are you going to do back? And that is a question that all nations have struggled with for a while. If there was some kind of retaliation or response to this intrusion, then people might be more careful in doing it, or they might be more constrained in doing it. But so far we have not agreed on what an appropriate response would be. And in this case, we've had this discussion, I think NATO has had this discussion, others have had this discussion. Is the mere act of penetration, it's a violation of sovereignty, but is it the use of force? The general consensus is no, right? Is the act of penetration and leaving something behind the use of force? Well, it's closer, but we're in a gray area, and that gray area, until we get better experience on how we use these things, until we get clearer understanding, it's unclear how you respond to that. So you find something on your networks, everyone's done it, and we aren't sure what to do back.
Thank you, Jim. William, would you like to answer also?
Let me take it a little bit towards the track one, and from a commercial perspective, I see that there are actually many parallels at a commercial level too, where you have potentially state actors looking at commercial interests and leaving behind this blob of information. And I think that, yeah, we are looking at it from a commercial perspective quite far behind in the preparedness, because, like it or not, the commercial interests are already definitely in that battle space, and things are flying above them. Case in point, there are companies that I have worked with that would call you up at midnight and want to see you in the at some god-awful early time in the morning, ASAP, where the national police agency of that country will be with them, and they will thankfully let the CEO of such company know that, oh yes, we found this blob on a server during a particular investigation. All we can tell you is it came from your IP address, so we thought you should know. However, from a law enforcement perspective, they're in a very difficult bind, because since it's encrypted, they don't want to potentially give competitor information to a company and so on. The company is SOL. I shouldn't use weird acronyms like that. The company is really in a tough spot, because they don't know how to respond. They don't know what was stolen. They don't know if they were really affected, and so on. And the country and the law enforcement agency there themselves are at a loss here. And I think that from an intelligence gathering perspective, or to find out how to fix the problem, or to remediate, or if there's a disclosure issues, how we're in deadlock because we don't have this information exchange between governments and private businesses. And so to extend that to a private paradigm, it clearly shows that in preparing for this space that we're suddenly calling a battle space, the PPP for this is extremely lacking in many, many countries. And I think that unless that cooperation and we jump that gap to do this, I think we're going to be hard-pressed, at least in the near term.
Okay, thank you. Elina, then maybe Olaf, and then Isaac. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on Jim's point about this divergence of interpretations on what may be peacetime or not. And sometimes you see less technologically sophisticated countries getting caught up in that difference in opinion. And the most striking example I can think of is MH17. If you remember, that was a plane that got shot down. And what happened after that was, simply a case of Malaysians and the Dutch trying to seek justice for something that had been completely out of their control, the loss of civilian lives. And you saw this online battle taking place with trolls and hacking. And maybe that was peacetime to some. I'm sorry, maybe that was wartime for some. But for countries like Malaysia, who go out of their way to avoid conflict, let alone war, we inadvertently got caught up in that when we were trying to prove a strong case that this was a huge miscarriage of justice that had been done to innocent lives.
So I thought it very interesting that this blurring of the war boundaries occurring so easily, because for most people who work in the international peace and security space, it's a very important issue that this boundary not be blurred. So, for instance, even though Clausewitz did, of course, say that warfare is an extension of politics, there is also the Foucault and Lenin interpretation, which is basically politics is the extension of warfare. And that's a direct quote. The implication being is that war is a continuous state, not a discontinuous state, and that we're always at war. And there are, of course, countries that actually articulate such a philosophy, but that's not, thankfully, one international law usually holds. So that's not we're not usually always in a state of conflict. Are we then really in a state, though, where we have to prepare for nastiness the entire time with a floating boundary, a floating threshold? Is it better that we just get used to being vulnerable and exposed, or is it better to try to actually raise the assurance level? What do you think, Olaf?
So I think we have to prepare our readiness level regardless, because we don't know whether it's activism, cyber criminals, or state actors that are knocking on our doors or leaving a blob of information data on the system. We just don't know. So I think that it is upon all of us and we all know this is mainly the private sector, to continue to be vigilant and continue to raise the quality of our IT infrastructure to such a level that we can deal with what is coming on those systems and that the effects of misery are contained. I'm saying that very consciously in this way because it's about confidence levels and reasonable investments in defenses.
So wouldn't that make sense for government security as well? Because if you basically lower the amount of time that information security defenders have to spend on dealing with petty cybercrime issues, one can concentrate on the really serious attacks, and they're more likely to be addressed. Isaac, what do you think?
First of all, I think that I fully agree with Jim Lewis describing the gray area here. It's all gray, more or less. And it's not only reconnaissance that is needed. If you want to be prepared for cyber future warfare, it's not only reconnaissance, which is a neat word for spying. It's not this only intelligence, but you need sometimes to implant also some logic bombs and pieces of software inside the systems to be activated, not now, but during war or something like that. It's even more grayer in a way. And then people, the main problem here is that, let's talk about the private sector. Companies cannot do it. I mean, usually when we want to do something active, and we need to do it, because it will be too late to wait around the fence. Usually we don't give this authority to private sector. It's a business of governments. Of course, this is a new phenomenon, and we don't have yet the right rules and laws, etc. And so people do it. But if we think about logically, we shouldn't give this authority to private sectors. But if the government does it, then there is another problem arising, and you mentioned it. You said Snowden affair. And this is the tension between governments and privacy of their own citizens. Because you don't know on the face of it what is running in the network. You don't know it until you do something to decrypt it or something like this. And I don't know why. I mean, there are a lot of theories, but in the Western democratic world, people tend to distrust their own governments, especially their intelligence services. You may explain logically that it's wrong, it shouldn't be like this, but this is something we have to admit. And they trust Google and Facebook and these companies much more than they trust their own intelligence services. This is a fact of life. So in Israel, I'll come back to Israel, when we try to solve this, and again, this was work that I did for our government, we try to solve this, we try to minimize the tension. I mean, you cannot really sacrifice security for privacy or the other way around, because these are two important values. So minimize the tension between them. One example is that our authority, the Cyber Defense Authority, National Cyber Defense Authority of Israel, unlike NSA or other parallel organizations in the world, doesn't have a mission to catch the bad guys. Their only mission in life is to clean the network. It's not only the network, also the chain of supply, but to clean the network, let's say. They have to detect possible malwares and to eliminate them from the system. The same way that a medical doctor, sometimes we get some diseases that we are ashamed to tell sometimes even our families that we got it. Okay? And we still tell our medical doctors that we have it because it doesn't run and then publish it in the paper. He doesn't even ask us, it's not his business, where did we get it from? His only job in life is to clean our body from the real viruses, not the biological one, not the virtual ones. The same with this authority. Their only job is to clean the system from the malware. If they suspect that the malware is coming from this IP or that IP, they should bring it to the right law enforcement agency, the police, the internal security service, depends on the context, and they will do the normal things they do. Once they have some evidence that something is happening, they can go to court and get order, et cetera, et cetera. And in this way, we minimized, I mean, we didn't eliminate, but minimized the tension between two. Information sharing in Israel between private sector and government is in a much better situation than in most of the countries I know about because of small things like this, but important things.
Thank you. So you've heard a number of different interpretations of what preparing the battle space could look like. I'm sure that you may have also your own interpretations. Very curious to hear them. You probably know the drill by now. If you have a question, it's hard to see from here. Please stand up and identify yourself if possible. Do we have any questions?
If none of you talk, we'll talk more, so that's a threat.
So let
There
me,
we go. That threat worked. So, please over here.
Thank you. Laurent Giselle from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I have one remark and one question. The remark is following Jim Lewis, your account of the reply of the negotiator discussing the attacks against the Ukrainian electricity grid, and you said that he told you that maybe the Russians don't think it's peacetime. And I find that very interesting because if it's not peacetime, but it's armed conflict, we not only have GG very important but non-binding norms, but we actually have a rule which is the prohibition to direct an attack against a civilian object. And electricity grid is normally a civilian object in the first place, unless you can show that it's a military objective in that particular circumstances, for example, because it provides electricity to a military camp, but normally it's a civilian object which is protected by the law as it exists. So I find that remark very interesting. My question is more following, it's for whoever in the panel, but following a remark by Professor Ben Israel on the fact that it's a gray area and that it's normal for the preparation of the battlefield to put logic bomb in place in advance on potential adversary networks to activate them later on. And I'm wondering, why is it considered to be a gray area and why is it considered to be possibly seen as allowed? In the sense that in the physical world, of course, directing weapons to potential enemies in advance is not a violation, but implanting mines or other possible bombs already on enemy territory would probably be considered by many states a violation of their own sovereignty. So why wouldn't they also consider this a violation of their sovereignty, that somebody plants malware already in computers sitting on their own territory?
So thank you for that question. It's a very interesting one. It could be also extended to an example under the law of the sea. For instance, a naval mine in a sea harbor or a naval mine within a naval harbor, for instance, is that not similar to a situation of having malware prepositioned in one system? And why would the malware prepositioning be not escalatory or dangerous or even illegal, why the naval mine or other prepositioned weapon would be?
I'll try to explain the difference. By the way, before I do this, my research center at Tel Aviv University is called ICRC. It's Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center. And the first phone call I got was from the Red Cross because they also use the ICRC. But I'll try to explain the difference. Let's say, I mean, any country should prepare itself to war in certain contexts, okay? So let's say I want to attack, to prepare myself to attack certain targets on the enemy territory. I can build a missile. Let's take this example. I can build a missile, and I do it only in my area. I don't have to do anything there but spying, which is a different issue. And once there will be a war, I'll push the button, the missile will jump and cross the atmosphere and fall on the target. You cannot do something like this with cyber weapons. Cannot. I mean, you jump on the cyber missile, it doesn't go through the atmosphere to the target. Should go from one server to another server to another server. Perhaps the first ones will be in your own country. Most of them will be in servers around the world, and especially in the enemy territory. And if you don't prepare for this, you'll never be able to use it. So there is a difference here, and it's, as I said, it's a gray area. I mean, there is a problem here too. What do? We have to think about it and find ways to overcome it. Otherwise, I will have no option but wait for some bad guys that don't follow the norms to attack me, and that's all, which is not good as well.
So, Isaac, you mentioned that if you don't use those capabilities, they may disappear, and it reminds me of something that actually Joe Nye recently said, that there's a use it or lose it situation with cyber weapons, that if you don't use them soon, at one point either they'll be patched or you lose the access.
Point. This is a different point, and this was not my point at all. You cannot send it. Let's say the target is there is a war and it is legitimate, and I may attack the power production of certain enemy country. Okay, I cannot send something that will fall on the power production facility. It should do the way through its servers, and if I don't prepare for this before the war, I won't be able to do it. It's not that I have something I want to use it. And this is more relevant to rockets and aircraft than to cyber weapons.
Jim, please.
And to build on Laurent's point, because he's done some of the better work on thinking through this, we still have large areas of ambiguity, and sometimes that ambiguity is compounded by our, and I'm as guilty as anyone, our desire to use metaphors and analogies. So it's not a cyber weapon. You aren't stockpiling it, you know. The weapon analogy is imprecise, and it's imprecise in what qualifies as the use of force. There's a tacit agreement that if there's death or destruction, it could qualify as the use of force. Please note that use of force is not the same thing as an act of war, which I don't believe has any meaning under international law. But we have large areas of ambiguity in this space that make it difficult to apply our existing norms and practices to thinking about how to govern it. And if you think about the reconnaissance perspective, we had a general agreement or a general understanding that, see, that was reconnaissance. You know, if I fly a satellite over your country and take a picture of it and figure where a target is, you may not like it, but there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, it has not violated your sovereignty, although some would argue, yes, my sovereignty extends. And we do not have that clarity when it comes to the discussion here. We may get that over time. One thing to think about in this target, though, is a cyber attack will be more like a precision-guided munition than this kind of indiscriminate effect weapon. It's like Stuxnet, looking for a particular target. You know, the delivery vehicle spread around the world, but the payload only hit its one intended target. So as we start gaining experience, I think some of these areas of ambiguity that Laurent touched upon will go away, but we do not yet have that experience.
Thank you. Any more questions? Ma'am?
I'm Lisa Bast, and I'm with the Estonian Information System Authority. And it's not that maybe the Russians think it's not peacetime. We know for a fact that the Russians don't care if it's peacetime or not. And it's very clear that in the past 20 years, the Russian approach to international law is slightly different from any other nations, and particularly the community of like-minded nations, whichever way we define that. And therefore, as Jim mentioned, the threshold of use of force and all-round attack is irrelevant in cyberspace because it simply does not apply to Russia. Which brings me to two questions. First of all, where do we, knowing that that's the battle space, where do we draw the line of usefulness of international law as a tool? And second of all, where do we draw the line of usefulness of nations as actors? Are there alternative actors, commercial or otherwise, that could possibly do a better job than nations and communities of nations? Because we have that fundamental disagreement of peace and war, amongst other things.
Thank you very much. We've heard Microsoft making proposals the last couple of days. Definitely a corporate proposal, for instance. And I'm sure, I don't know if Mike Schmidt is in the room, but I'm sure he would be interested in addressing the international law question. But first, I'd like to put it to our panel. Who would like to pick this up? We can start with Jim.
I'll talk quickly then. First, the usefulness of international law. One of the things that I think is interesting is we're in a period where the international structure that was constructed after the Second World War is degrading. And you could talk about how quickly it's degrading, but part of that is countries' willingness to obey the norms and laws that were created then. And we see this around the world. How you reverse that is a good question for policy. I'll reserve on the question of actors. Maybe someone else could speak better to that. But the concern for me is that international law is less powerful in guiding state behavior than it was, say, 20 years ago. And so can we fix that? And if so, how?
So the corollary to that question was maybe other laws could be useful on other agreements and other actors. So Olof, Elina, would you care to address the issue? Is it time to explore other avenues of dealing with the situation that not only rely on government? Olof, for you, of course, it's an interesting position to be in because in your world, internet governance, government is not the most important actor by any stretch of imagination. So how would you phrase the problem?
I guess it comes back that most of these targets might not be military in their sense, so to speak. Sony hack was Sony. Financial systems that are under attack. Supply chains that are under attack. So in those cases, I think the private sector has an incredibly big role in protecting these infrastructures. A lot of the information sharing goes on there, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's necessarily two different worlds at some point. There is not a military defense world and a civil defense world. These things merge, and I don't know what that means in terms of offensive actors. That is not my, that's not my forte.
Jim, do you have a point you want to make to that?
Sure. Oh gosh, you caught me off guard.
I did.
So one, I think we need to be more precise in thinking about what the targets of attack are. When we're talking about preparation of the battlefield, I think that very often it will be military systems that are the target, not civilian systems. And I always have a cute story. Some of you might have heard me tell you this, but in attacking the financial system, I had a Chinese intelligence colleague tell me, don't worry about it, we'll never attack the financial system because we own it, right? And so there's a fair point here about what do you get military advantage from by attacking? And turning out the lights doesn't get me military advantage, right? I'm sorry, it just doesn't. So we might want to think of it that way. What are the targets? And how do we perhaps we may need to distinguish between this large area of unhappy activity that's largely criminal and then a much more narrow area of military activity.
Thank you.
Go wave your hand.
So
Alex.
Please, Elina.
I just wanted to offer a slightly different perspective about this idea of the elasticity of the battle space. There's talk, as we know right now, that electoral systems, for example, and democracies might be considered critical infrastructure and therefore off limits in peacetime. But I mean, that assumes a certain value judgment over democratic systems, which obviously many countries are comfortable with, but not every country is comfortable with. In Southeast Asia, we are a mixture of different types of government systems, and there is equal respect for all, regardless of what we may think of those differences in governance. So if electoral systems are to be considered critical infrastructure, and other types of governance systems are not, then there is this inequality that will continue to pervade in cyberspace. And I think perhaps we need to widen our thinking a little bit beyond simply democracies, because the world is not just comprised of Western liberal democracies.
No.
Thank you. Do we have a follow-up question for that? The gentleman over there in the back, please.
Good afternoon, Robert Dewar from the Centre for Security Studies at the ETH in Zurich. I have two observations. The second one is slightly more of a question.
Good.
We're talking about cyberspace as a battle space, and I was just wondering how far the panel thinks that the uniqueness of cyber capabilities as military capabilities has potentially been overemphasized. I'm not trying to go down the route of what Thomas Rid says, that cyber war will not take place. I'm more looking at the nature of cyber warfare. Cyber capabilities are ubiquitous throughout an entire battle space, throughout all the kind of domains of warfare, simply because of the reliance of all these other domains on the technical capabilities that cyberspace and cyber techniques can afford. So my question for the panel is, has that potentially been overemphasized, or should we still consider the cyber capabilities as something that needs to be considered separately to, say, chemical, nuclear, biological, other more conventional forms of warfare? But following on from that, and I suppose this observation is particularly directed at Mr. Saito, given his experience in both the public and private sectors. If we need to consider cyberspace separately, or if we need to depending on which way we jump, whether we need to consider cyberspace in the totality of a country's warfighting capacity and dealing with the battle space. Given what you said earlier about the amount of private sector involvement in the infrastructure on which cyberspace relies, how far should then the private sector be further brought into perhaps a state's defense capacities, capabilities, or is there some other solution to that particular problem? Thank you.
Thank you. William?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a multifaceted question. I'm not a warfare expert, but I think it's clear to see that they're inextricably interconnected, so it's not one and the other. I think that if we see a lot of warfare today, you have a cyber response first to weaken the opponent, and then you use the traditional means in many cases, so I think that they're inextricably linked. The concern that I have, at least from a private sector and from a civilian government perspective, is that in this battle space, whether it's pre-positioning or creating 0 days or looking for vulnerabilities or gathering intelligence and so on, that we have this battle space being created, and I understand, and that is going on. But we also see remnants of that falling and affecting the civilian area that we need to be cognizant of. And I think that the WannaCry ransomware was a very good example of that, where we have a delivery mechanism developed definitely for a battle space preparation type scenario, yet any 13-year-old could bolt on the delivery mechanism and use a payload to affect civilians in unforeseen kind of ways. And so how that gets affected from the government, at least from where I sit, is that yes, there are things that are going on in discussions, especially from what Jim is saying, and the battle space preparations, but there are knock-on effects here that we need to be cognizant about, because this technology has multi-use. that, that you have this where you could spend millions of dollars developing the quote-unquote weaponry in a military context, but it's portable. And so these kinds of things, I think, we are going to see issues that, as from a civilian side of things, you need to be aware of. And this is a debate on where that crossover and how we prepare for such incidents and to be more resilient as a society is going to take more and more of our time.
So, Jim, you wanted to raise a point here? And also, maybe you can tell us if you think that digital weapons is a good introduction to atomic, biological, chemical.
Well, I thought it was a great question, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot. But I think that what Tom was referring to, and it's a point that many have made, is that you won't see a pure cyber war, that people aren't going to just do cyber attacks on each other because the risk of escalation is far too high. For militaries, a military that does not develop cyber techniques may as well ride horses into battle because they're just not going to do that well. And the real frontier now is the merger of electronic warfare and cyber warfare and how you move to active measures in the EW or the electromagnetic space. So this is, maybe you don't like technological change in warfare, but it's sort of inevitable. Our problem is we often tend to confuse a couple things. One is we tend to confuse coercive and criminal actions with the military actions. A huge number of coercive and criminal actions, very few actions that would qualify under the most liberal interpretation as an attack. The other thing that we have trouble with is we still have this link that cyber is somehow an extension of nuclear. And I was thinking that today, could I ask everyone who was a nuclear arms controller to well, never mind. I was going to ask them to do something rude to themselves because it's not a very useful metaphor. But we have this imprecise linkage here that nations are slowly defining the borders of what is permissible and what would trigger retaliation. And so as we make that line clearer, I think some of the questions you've raised and the panel has raised will be answered. But until we get there, and it might require experience, there will be just a high degree of imprecision.
Thank you. Itzhak?
Well, one thing that I agree with the question that, weapons of mass destruction are called weapons of mass destruction because they can cause mass destruction, not because it's horrible by itself. It's very difficult to cause such a scale of destruction by cyber attack. Destruction, I'm not speaking about criminal activity and things like this. Human lives. It's very difficult to do it by cyber attack unless you use it to activate some atomic biological weapon, which is also can happen, but because there are not many weapons like this in the world, I guess everyone who has it can do something and isolate it from such a possibility. But if we are not talking about activating one of these weapons, a cyber attack has a huge influence on our society, on everything, but it's not a weapon of mass destruction. Still, it's very important. You can easily cause aircraft to fall from sky. Only 500 people dying in one attack. It's not mass destruction, but we all remember what happened when the Twin Towers with 3,000 people, 2,000 people died in one attack. It changed the world. It's not the same world as it used to be before. And therefore, I think we should, although it's not a weapon of mass destruction, we should consider it very seriously.
Thank you. So I think we have time maybe for one more question, but I would like to also pose my own question to the panel. Since the question of government responsibility has come up a couple of times, I'd like to go back to something I think that was discussed a number of times over the last couple of days, which is the vulnerability equity process in the US, the VEP process, which is the managed process for disclosing 0 days based on a number of different factors. So General Michael Hayden once made the point that as part of this process, they had a consideration that asked if when they talked about a vulnerability or a class of vulnerability, it can be also an entire class, and they decided if they should release it or not, one of the questions they asked was, does anybody have the ability to exploit it, both technically or theoretically, or do only we have this capability? This was the so-called no-bus question, as he defined it. And if by releasing this vulnerability, would it inadvertently, effectively heighten the arms race in cyberspace, so to speak, or encourage other actors to develop research in a particular area and therefore increase overall tension? So the question I'd like to put to the panel is, what do you think their proper response would be in terms of from a moral, logical argument? Is it a good argument to be able to say, only we have this ability and therefore we shouldn't release it to draw attention? Or is it a bad question to ask because it means that effectively other actors who may have developed the capability without knowledge of another government might be able to develop it independently and therefore increase the whole strategic dilemma? Can I start with you, William, and then move on down the line?
Well, I think it's pretty apparent that if we do find vulnerabilities, the no-bus or nobody but us scenario sometimes is not necessarily the case and can have some incredible impact. I think that also, given our dependency on ICT as a society and that we have many more people and more eyeballs looking at this problem, that there is a high possibility that the vulnerabilities are also discovered in a relatively similar time frame elsewhere. That at the end of the day, if you look at other innovations in the past, whether it's automobiles or the airlines, it doesn't do much in terms of gaining trust of the user and becoming societally more dependent on this and putting more of our reliance on this technology if we can't trust it. And I think that it becomes critical that we foster the information sharing because it'll only enhance the resilience and it'll only make things better. And I think that through the natural progression of things, it's how to create that structure where businesses aren't tagged for disclosing, a vulnerability or a problem that they had, and governments who do this kind of discovery can have a process so that not only do we disclose this, but the other issue that we find is that we need to have people care more and implement these patches and be more up to date on this. It's still frightening to see that when we have Yahoo, for example, attacked and the passwords compromised, that only 5% of the users have really changed their passwords and so on. And so this whole area, just in general for society, hasn't caught up in terms of how vulnerable and how important these issues are. But I am more of the stance that yes, as I think the disclosing of and sharing of this quickly is probably the direction that we need to head.
Thank you. Isaac?
I don't think there is a difference here between cyber technology and other areas in our life, especially biological diseases. Okay? Let's say you do a research in order to find a new drug to heal something important. Okay? Would you publish the results? I mean, someone may use the results in order to create a weapon. This time, I mean a biological weapon. And there's no difference between the two. And usually, history, experience taught us that you better publish and progress and deal with all these difficulties, because there are difficulties, and not try to hide it in such a way that at the end of the day will stop progress.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I started my introduction saying knowledge is prolific. Once knowledge is out there, or the knowledge is in the air, so to speak, things will be discovered. So I'm with William here, and actually with Isaac. Be open, make sure that these things get reported, and make sure that they're fixed. I think that is the right bias. That doesn't give you perhaps all the confidence that you need, because the amount of bugs that are around and that are being reported, we heard some numbers this morning. You turn on the hotline and you get 200,000 bugs a year. It's amazing to cope with, but I think, yeah, the bias should be to disclose responsibly.
Thank you. Elena?
Yeah, I'm going to be boring and fall in line as well. I'm not going to be provocative this time. I think ideally there should be a more synergistic relationship between governments and the private sector. Obviously, it would have to depend on the context, and there are going to be tough choices to be made. But I think generally that is the right bias for greater transparency and disclosure.
Thank you. Jim?
Oh, well, as you can imagine, in the US now, there's quite an intense internal debate, at least among those who are government employees, about what the heck we're supposed to be doing anymore. I'm not a government employee anymore, but I think the conclusion is that our duty is to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, right? And this is a crucial point because we want to ask ourselves, who can best deliver public goods? This has been an issue in this panel and in others. There's a reaction to the large embracing state that developed after the experiences of the 1930s and 1940s. Why that happened is a subject for different discussion, but you have this pushback here that there's someone other than the state that can deliver public goods. And we are exploring this area somewhat inelegantly. But for me, it is the state that has the responsibility to defend its citizens. And so the state needs to ask itself, what best protects its citizens and serves their interests? And so that's the perspective we want to look at from the VEP, the vulnerability process. My own view is it's too narrow. When you talk, I'm trying to get a handle on this, and it's hard to get good research. There appears to be an infinite galaxy of vulnerabilities. Now, if that was true, you would see that reflected in the price, right? And so we can look at pricing measures of vulnerabilities. It's still relatively high, so maybe there's a cost to discovering them. But if you have an infinite galaxy of vulnerabilities, the VEP is just too narrow to catch them all, and so we need to think of a different approach to be effective. But for me, the key issue for policy is how does the state best protect its citizens? And if the VEP contributes to that, great. If it doesn't, let's move on.
Thank you. So I don't see any questions at the moment. If there is that gentleman over there?
I thought we were done.
Okay. Then I'm going to provide the panelists with one last round of final statements, and before we close, we only have a minute left. Everybody can do a quick 30-second statement. William?
Yeah, so I opened by saying that we have definitely transitioned from a Cold War, where NATO obviously was created in response to that, into a Code War scenario. And I think it's that we have these paradigms where we take the bad of the Cold War and we're now transforming this digitally, and there are a lot of gray areas that we will see, and in some sense, yeah, private industry is caught in the middle of this, but that this code is very portable and can cross over, vice versa. So it'll be interesting and would be really sad to see what this opportunity that's internet provides that we could lose, where things like the word Internet of Things could easily mean Internet of Threats, or worse, insecurity of things, and hopefully we can prevent that.
Thank you. Isaac?
I think this panel was a wonderful demonstration of something that I already phrased in my mind years ago, that cyber problems, although they have usually technological solutions, the problems are never technological. We spoke here about legal aspects, psychology of people, confidence, trust, you name it. If you don't understand these aspects, you don't really understand what technology you need to solve the problems.
Thank you.
It's very hard to provide wise words at this time. No, it's, so yeah, no, I think that is. So I think that we're what we see in the panel is that we actually are trying to tackle a incredibly complex a problem where there's a balance of nation-state interest of protecting their own people. There is a civil society, or my sort of perspective of how do we protect this global public good that's called the internet, making sure that the many perspectives across the globe are actually represented. So we have an incredible complex discussion on our hands, and I think it's very important that those various perspectives actually get to the table and have this conversation, including more than just the Western world and advanced nations.
Thank you, Olaf.
Thank you. I'll just echo that, actually. I suspect I was put on this panel for a reason. I'll try to serve my purpose, and my purpose is to encourage people to think a little outside the box, a little laterally, beyond what sometimes assumed concepts and premises. The concept of nation and battle space. Well, not all countries think alike, and so I just like to highlight that.
This has been a great panel, and one of the reasons it was great is that, I came here thinking, well, maybe I won't hear anything new, but I heard a lot of new things, including for the first time in my life a reference to Foucault in a discussion of cybersecurity. So that was remarkable. But what I draw from this is, in many ways, we are still sort of groping towards answers, and we need to have a lot more discussion, that we can identify problems, we can talk about potential solutions, but we have not yet worked through all the dilemmas. And so this could be a long discussion. I look forward to doing it again with all of you.
Thank you very much. So as Olaf said, it's been a long day. We are well out of time. And I think it's clear that preparing the battlefield is a question that also requires some preparation, also requires some pre-positioning, but the only positioning that you're probably interested in right now is your position in the line for drinks, coffee, etc. So please join me in thanking our panel for the discussion.
And on behalf of the center, thank you so much. Some candy.